The following half-hour show is a paid political program and is not endorsed by this station, management, or staff.
The following program is sponsored by Excalibur Insurance Management Services.
This week's guest is Gene Barr, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Pennsylvania Chamber of Commerce. Mr. Barr has more than 40 years of experience in various facets of government, politics, and business operations. He worked for British Petroleum America for 12 years, ultimately ascending to one of their top governmental affairs officers, and was responsible for all legislative activities in 6 states. He left British Petroleum to join the Associated Petroleum Industries of Pennsylvania, where he handled all legislative and regulatory activity that affected the major oil companies. He became executive director in 1997. In 2000, he left to join the law firm of McNeese, Wallace & Nurek, Harrisburg's largest law firm, in their governmental relations division. Gene was appointed by Pennsylvania Governor Ed Rendell to serve on the Economic Stimulus Oversight Commission, and was appointed by Pennsylvania Governor Tom Corbett to serve on the Marcellus Shale Advisory Commission. In 2021, Gene was ranked number 10 on Pennsylvania's Power 100 list, and was included in Penn Live's list of the 17 most influential people in Pennsylvania politics. Gene graduated from St. Joseph's University with a degree in political science. We will discuss with him on this week's show Pennsylvania's proposed entry into the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative known as RGGI, and the potential catastrophic collateral damage that this move could precipitate.
This is the Volpe Report, a weekly news and political interview show examining the latest local, state, and national issues with Chuck Volpe. Insightful, informative, controversial, the area's premier political talk show, the Volpe Report.
Gene, welcome to the Volpe Report.
Chuck, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me back on. Greatly appreciate it.
Well, we appreciate in northeast and central Pennsylvania and the 25 or 6 counties in our media market to be able to have an expert who understands from your background both the political component, government relations component, as well as having worked in the gas and oil industry for so many years. You're uniquely qualified. I think I said last time, as an old trial lawyer myself, I could get you qualified. In fact, they would stipulate to your expertise. And I think it's important just to remind people, you don't become president of the Pennsylvania Chamber of Commerce, the 5th largest state, the 2nd largest energy producer in this nation at a time when energy prices are skyrocketing, gasoline is going crazy. You're in a very, very important and pivotal position, and will have a loud voice in what happens in the future. And I'm going to segue right in. We talked in the spring about RGGI, which for our viewers, if they don't remember, is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative and gets referred to as RGGI. And there was a lot of push and public comment at that time in opposition to RGGI. The governor's been pushing hard to institute it. Well, the reason you're here today specifically, and I want to get my names right, the Independent Regulatory Review Commission, the IRRC, voted in a 3-2 vote to approve the state's entrance into RGGI. And that came, of course, after some time after the Environmental Quality Board also voted earlier this year to enter into RGGI. But make no mistake, the governor is unilaterally putting Pennsylvania into RGGI, which I think would be a catastrophe in light of what's going on around the world, in our own region. But you're the expert, so that's the reason you're on. And I'll end with this. Obviously, lawsuits are being filed as we speak by the General Assembly and other groups to stop this. The argument is that the governor does not have the constitutional authority or the legal authority or statutory authority to unilaterally put us into RGGI. So take it from there. All
right. So I want to leave that to the lawyers to debate. But let me tell you our concerns with it, which we did talk about before, but now they've come more to fruition. We're willing to have a discussion about what it would take because we do believe we need to address the issue of CO2. And we have a lot of members who are willing to do that. And so we made the decision we would sit down. Unfortunately, and since we've talked, not a single thing that we have mentioned that would have made RGGI more palatable to Pennsylvania would have made it more effective, would have made it less economically damaging, was adopted. And so we saw, again, come to fruition what we had feared. And as I think I said the last time, we've always been concerned, and nothing has changed our mind about going into a compact with states like New York and New Jersey that clearly, as witnessed by the cancellation of the Penn East pipeline here in 2 weeks ago, those states do not have our economic best interest. I would argue that they're playing much more to someone like Vladimir Putin than they are to people here in Pennsylvania and the hardworking people here who work in that industry and who need that energy in order to work, play, and live. And so we've seen nothing. If we want to do something, maybe what we ought to do is go into a compact with West Virginia and Ohio that are energy producing states as well, because what's going to happen, the way RGGI's structured now, there's a real threat that if RGGI's implemented, those states will simply begin to take over where Pennsylvania energy becomes too expensive to get into the marketplace.
People need to understand how not only this is going to affect Americans, affect Pennsylvanians, but they're going to say, oh, that's hyperbole and overstated. The balance of world power is also at stake in this because of the energy crisis. We're lucky enough in the United States to have enough energy, but in Europe, the United Kingdom, in large swaths of the undeveloped world, they don't have enough energy, and people are going to die this winter, either from cold or starvation. And they're going to go to the source and have to pledge fealty to the source that will fix that problem for them. And we in the United States are sitting on vast reserves of energy and jobs and impact to our communities. And so I'll get to that later, but pick it up there. What's going on?
It is, you're absolutely right. I mean, what's happening now has geopolitical implications. And it is incredible to me at a time. And look, I understand President Biden's concerned about climate change. I understand that. But you references $3.5 trillion, much of which will go into programs ostensibly designed to address climate change. In reality, when you look at things like subsidies for electric cars, those go to the wealthy. I don't know how many people are driving around inner city areas in electric cars. I suspect there's not a whole heck of a lot. So we know where those dollars go. But the thing that is really, to me, appalling is, as you note, we're such a strength in the energy side. Number 2 in terms of natural gas production, number 2 overall in terms of energy. And you have President Biden begging the Saudis and the Russians to develop and to produce and to send out to us more fossil fuels. Look, their fossil fuel, it's called global climate change for a reason. This is a global issue. So rather than have us produce it in a way where we've got environmental protections on it, you've got other nations, including Russia, where the environmental protections are far, far less. And as you note, produce geopolitical implications for Western Europe. Western Europe is depending on Vladimir Putin for their natural gas to keep themselves warm this winter. Do you really think they're going to risk antagonizing Russia over this? I don't think so.
Of course, well stated. I would like to, at this point, Gene, and I think, people watching this show, I'm obviously conservative in my outlook, and I'm sure the chamber and your views would be deemed somewhat conservative as well, and clearly not progressive. Let me put it that way. Well, I would like to introduce into our discussion now a couple of comments and statements. One is an editorial from New York Times writer Thomas L. Friedman. He does op-ed pieces nationally as well. I read him in the New York Times. I also catch him in our Scranton Times. And I read an article about a week ago that he had published. Now, this is from a progressive, liberal, left writer for the sacred New York Times, no less. So in terms of credibility, it will be tough for the left to challenge him as a right-wing ideologue. But I read this, and it's scary, what I read. And it's coming from someone who clearly, from the left, is even signaling the warning dangers. So a couple of direct quotes. Again, this is from Thomas Friedman. The headline is, "Prepare for the winter of our discontent." So that kind of sets you up for where he's going. And here's what he says, and I'm quoting now. "Several forces could make Vladimir Putin the king of Europe, enable Iran to thumb its nose at America and build its atomic bomb, and disrupt European power markets enough that the upcoming United Nations Climate Conference in Glasgow, Scotland, could suffer blackouts owing because of too little energy. So he has a sense of humor. He goes on, natural gas and coal prices in Europe and Asia just hit their highest levels on record. Oil prices in America hit a 7-year high, and United States gasoline prices are up $1 a gallon from last year. If this winter is as bad as some experts predict, I fear we'll see a populist backlash against the whole climate green movement. You can already smell that coming from Britain. That's just one part, so I'd like to get your comment on that so far.
Yeah, I've read a lot of Friedman, and some of what he says in the past I've agreed with. Much of what he says I haven't. But I think what we're seeing is a little bit, which I've wanted the environmentalists to do for years, which is be honest about this climate change issue. Great, it's a threat. We can determine how big of a threat it is. We've got some environmentalists who say it's going to actually be cheaper to figure out how to kind of mitigate and how we can live with. But I understand that. But when you hear people say it's not a problem, we can do this and actually address climate change and save money because wind and solar are cheaper than fossil fuel. Well, the reality is if they're cheaper than them, we'd be using them now. Who's blocking them from using them now? Because these are not alternative energies. As someone else has said, they're supplemental energies because you need natural gas, you need nuke, you need some of these others as backup on days when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. And so Friedman is seeing a lot of this now. He's acknowledging the geopolitical implications, which you and I just talked about. And again, it's incredible that we have a president who would be much, much quicker to offend the Canadians by canceling things like the Keystone XL pipeline that had been approved, as well as another pipeline in Michigan, than he is the Taliban. It's absolutely incredible how, unfortunately, this president is playing against our allies in many cases. We should be providing natural gas. And you noted earlier the problems in trying to move our natural gas over. We only have, I think, on the East Coast now, still one export harbor because we've dragged our feet. Again, red tape, permitting issues. We could be sending this over to Western Europe. They would love to have it from us, but we're not set up for that. So we have set ourselves up for failure. We have set ourselves up for higher energy, and we have harmed our energy independence because of all this. And again, by begging others to produce fossil fuel, we have done nothing. In fact, arguably made the environmental situation worse. I just wish that, the environmentalists would acknowledge that there are prices to be paid for this. People then could have an honest discussion about how we address climate change.
One of the things you've touched on there, Gene, and one of the things from all the reading I've done on the subject, Friedman references it, talking about two things you just touched on, and one other thing. He refers to natural gas, especially. He refers to it as a transitional fuel, necessary to take up the bulk of the energy needs, because in a perfect world, it's going to be a generation before there's enough alternative energy to truly phase out most of coal and fossil fuel, and even then we'll need natural gas. But he's saying especially now, it's a transitional fuel. Its carbon emissions is less than 50% of any of the other fossil fuels, which means it's clean energy, as clean as that energy could be. And the fact that we're not exporting it and using it as a transition fuel now is resulting in a change in the geopolitical power structure, will have dire effects in America. And the irony is in Pennsylvania, if we join RGGI, back to RGGI, is that we're going to have to pay money in tax to use our own produced fuel and have that determination set by states that have none. It's an amazing, I can't even believe we're talking about it.
There are major environmental groups who acknowledge the need for natural gas, because until we have some type of energy, some type of battery breakthrough for solar and wind, you're not going to be able to store it, which means you're going to have that backup. And as you note, I would agree with you. We're going to be using natural gas into the future, one, because it's a manufacturing feedstock for so many of the products we use, in many cases, life-saving fuels in the medical field. And so we know we're going to have that for a while. There's also some thought that in the future, the fuel source could be hydrogen from natural gas as opposed to the carbon. And wow. So there's so much that ties into that to simply say, as we've got many radicals doing, well, we're going to keep all this in the ground. We're going to block it. They weren't able to block and stop the development. So they've been engaged in stopping and blocking pipelines. And again, we saw that again in New York and New Jersey with the governors of those states being complicit in that, in harming Pennsylvania. And yet they want to turn around and say, come in and join us. We'll all join this compact. They do not have our best interest at heart. I don't know how strongly I can say that.
And let me just also point out that one of the points we made on this show, not with you, but with other guests, going all the way back to the start of the pandemic, it was like Wolf gave his proxy to Murphy in New Jersey and Cuomo in New York, that was they set the pandemic response with their draconian lockdowns and all the harm they did to the economies. Wolf pretty much just said, me too, on everything. He let them dictate it, and I don't see how the RGGI initiative would be any different. He's going to let states, like talk about New York, with, you know much better than me, the amount of fossil fuel and natural gas is underground in the state of New York, and yet they're importing their fossil fuel and natural gas from Russia and to the United States, so focused on climate change, they think apparently that some of these countries are going to play nice with us and that we're all on the same team. We're not all on the same team. We have different interests, and there are dangerous leaders that represent a clear and present danger to the national security of the United States. And we're squandering that. We've seen it, by the way, in the Afghanistan pullout and other things. You know, terror is going to be imported into the United States again, and there's no thought for beyond the immediate progressive agenda that is harming this country. And there's going to be a price we pay. It's not going to be enough, Gene, to say, oh, well, yeah, we made a big mistake. We're sorry. Well, people are going to be dead. People are going to die from energy shortages. And that's why this issue is so important.
Well, you know, you hate to say I told you so. You and I have talked about this before. We have been talking about this campaign that the Russians have engaged in, disinformation campaign against Pennsylvania and U.S. energy for a long time. We have seen it in social media. We have noted it. You can track the money that comes through some of these international environmental groups that comes from Russia. We've seen it. It's been reported a bit in Wall Street Journal and other other news outlets, but by and large, the media has ignored it. We're now seeing it. And as you noted earlier, the people who are really going to pay for this, in addition to those in other countries who now have to rely on Vladimir Putin to keep their homes warm this winter, are people of lower incomes because they pay a disproportionate amount of their income on heat and fuel. And we've already seen what's happening with, heat and food, with the food prices. And now, as noted, we're going to see it this year. Again, depending on how severe this winter is, we could have some really, really unfortunate circumstances out there and people really hurting on this. And again, we've seen it for years because we have not worked. We had energy independence. We could have secured it. We could have brought others energy independence. As I said, the folks in Western Europe would much rather rely on us than on Vladimir Putin. But now you've got a reduction in terms of what's happening in out looking for oil and natural gas, because companies are saying, I'm not sure if I'm going to be allowed to do it. Why should I go invest if my investment is going to be threatened by this administration? And so now you're seeing direct attacks on the U.S. and Pennsylvania's energy independence status.
Right. Well, amazingly, we made it this far in the show, Gene, without even mentioning another one of our friends in the world complex, geopolitical complex, and that's China. And you know, another thing that doesn't get talked about enough is we're almost bending over backwards to the point of almost harming our own citizens to compensate for the fact that China, which is categorized as an undeveloped country, and therefore some of the accords that the developed countries like us have to participate in, they're exempt from. I read somewhere that 8 of the top 10 polluting cities in the world are Chinese cities. And they're one of the biggest, if not the biggest polluter. And again, apparently they're our good buddies, and they're gonna do the right thing, not only by climate change, but in handling the relationships around the world that apparently environmentalists think that that's the beginning and end. You know, I said kiddingly once that, you know, the way things are going with our economy, you know, 2 generations from now, our children better learn how to speak Chinese. So those issues that we're talking about now, I hope people understand, have a direct and immediate impact on our future, our freedoms, and our place in the world.
You know, you brought up a couple things. You know, this lack of common sense, almost hypocrisy, and you're absolutely right. The Chinese were largely exempted from the conditions that were put on us. And at the time that we were walking through all this and that we were beginning to reduce, and you know, we have reduced and significantly addressed our carbon issues, China was out building coal-fired power plants at the same time. And you had referenced earlier, and I think it's important to go back. New York, as you know, has significant natural gas reserves. Much of the fields that exist under PA extend up into New York. They have blocked and forbid all development of their natural gas. Meanwhile, what's happening is they are using more polluting sources to develop their own electricity. And you've also had the state of New Jersey, the folks in charge of energy there, say they can't assure a ready supply of natural gas this year. Meanwhile, the state is blocking the production and the movement of natural gas from Pennsylvania into New Jersey. It's insane. And, you know, there's so much lunacy out there. And you're right. You know, the Chinese were exempted. We export some of our oil now. Where does that oil go? It goes to China. Well, if you stop that, then what happens is they go elsewhere, and we have no leverage over the Chinese anymore on that. What little leverage we do have. But you're absolutely right. The Paris Accord said basically, all China, we're going to treat you differently. Right. Why should they be treated differently than we get treated? Let me
throw in another clarion call, and I'd like to read you his quotes, and that's for Bill Blaine, one of the top international market strategists. He's, of course, from London, United Kingdom, Great Britain, and he has something called Blaine's Morning Porridge. I'm quoting, "People are going to die of cold. As the price of energy goes higher, the cost will fall disproportionately upon the poorest in society. Income inequalities will be dramatically exposed as the most vulnerable in society face a stark choice: heat or eat. This winter in the United Kingdom is likely to be on its knees begging for energy. Europe will be in as much trouble. The Middle East will get to charge whatever they can get away with, and the capacity to deliver is limited. And Vladimir Putin will invite each European leader to plead their case individually, menacingly asking each leader why he should open the gas taps to their nation specifically. Make no mistake, this winter is going to be shocking. Be aware." So again, I mean, yeah, that's not, yeah, I mean, he points out later that, Friedman does, that American citizens are okay for this winter. They'll have food and they'll have, heat. But all around us, the world is facing catastrophic issues coming this winter, and we are looking at a very real potential change in the power structure of the geopolitical stratosphere that we exist in.
Chuck, I hate to keep going back to it, but this has been coming. Putin has played the long game on this one. Putin could look back and say, look, he could exacerbate tensions over natural gas in Pennsylvania and other places. As I said, we saw this and we had people say, I can't believe the Russians would do it. Now, these same people, in many cases, would readily acknowledge the Russians were involved in trying to impact our elections. They readily acknowledge that. But somehow the fact that Vladimir Putin could set himself up incredibly strong from an economic basis, he would never do that. This is what he has set up. As you note in what you've quoted there, he has set himself up for countries other than us at this point to come to him begging, hat in hand, to say, please, please, please help us keep our people warm. And at this point, we're not set up to assist them because we have dragged our feet in terms of setting up the infrastructure where we could assist the UK, Germany, France, etc. They need to go to Putin. He has played the long game on this. This has come to fruition. This is what literally, I can remember having conversations with people. I was at a conference at the U.S. Army War College 5 years ago, and we had this conversation about this coming down and the fact that the people there even saw Putin engaged in doing this at that time. It's now coming to fruition.
Well, actually, even though generally speaking, America won't be in that situation, but maybe New York and New Jersey will. Maybe New York will, since they're getting their gas from him too. Maybe they'll be on their bended knees begging Putin for gas that they're going to need in their state that's already been racked by COVID-19. Their economy has been crushed. New York City, by all accounts, is still a ghost town. And while all that's going on, they're going to be on bended knee to Vladimir Putin as well to get their energy so they can kowtow to the progressive far-left environmentalists in their own party, the Democratic Party.
And look, while we have it, we don't know how expensive it's going to be this winter. You and I were talking about the cost. While we have it, and as I said, there's the note from the folks in New Jersey saying they can't assure a reliable function with natural gas. And New York has said similar things in the past. So they are jeopardizing the well-being of their own states by their short-sighted attention in terms of trying to block Pennsylvania's ongoing development of natural gas.
Right. So now, again, I always keep coming back to Reggie that apparently we're heading into now in Pennsylvania. And it's a cap and trade program. We kind of broke down the dynamics and the mechanism in the spring. But getting back to the Reggie thing, talk a little bit, Gene, and you're in a great position to do it. Forecast what that's going to do to Pennsylvania's economy in the direct impact. We're going to be in a position of having to pay a tax, which will fall on Pennsylvanians, despite what they say, pay a tax for our own energy. We're buying back our own energy effectively that we're going to have to put into this Reggie initiative, which includes 13 states, and effectively pay tax to get what should be free for us, correct?
Yeah. So first, we still have an opportunity here. And in all honesty, I hate to make this partisan, we're going to need Democrats to weigh in on this and come out against Reggie. And some of them have already. There's a lot of Democrats, obviously office holders in your area. They need to understand what's at stake here. And then what's at stake is what you and I have laid out here. Now, in terms of, as you note, there's going to be a tax on carbon. We're not quite sure that money gets returned to Pennsylvania, but for what? They could simply, rather than give it back to the people that paid for it, they could provide it to people saying, well, we want to give it over here. We want to pay for more alternative energy. We want to give them a subsidy. And all of a sudden you're dealing with that. In addition to that, we don't know what these states are going to require of us. There's something, and not to get too technical, but there's this what's called the baseline of emissions. How deep are you going to have to cut? Pennsylvania, by virtue of rolling out natural gas, has made significant cuts to our CO2 emissions over the years. Now, the reason the people in Reggie want us is we provide them all their energy. Yes, Pennsylvania has as many CO2 emissions as the rest of the Reggie states, which is Virginia all the way up to Maine combined. Why? We provide their energy. That's our economy in many cases. So as you cut those and you put those restrictions on, it hurts our economy worse than anyone else's.
Well stated, Gene. And regrettably, I wish I had you for about another half hour, but our half hour is up. Thank you so much again for making time. And as I said to you in the spring, I hope you'll be a regular guest because the fight is worth fighting and our future depends on it. Not just our energy future and our climate future. That's I hope that people take from this show. It's more than just a fight between climate change and energy reductions and clean energy. The fight is a political one and a geopolitical one and will definitely impact our national security and change the power structure in this world we live in. And we're going to have to hope that we get treated well by countries that flat out have been our enemies in the past. And that's very concerning to me. And that's an issue that gets, they like to frame the issue as just environment versus climate change and clean energy without talking about how we get there and the impact it's going to have on world security. And that's a concern we need to talk about.
Absolutely. I'd argue, just as you said, and just to succinctly state, this is not just environmentalists versus energy producers. In many cases, this is democratic institutions versus totalitarian ones.
Well put, Gene. Thank you so much.